All right, I'm Kevin Miller. I'm the writer, director, and co-producer of Hellbound, and we have here three of the folks who are in the film, and Brad Jersak on the far left, Archbishop Lazar Puhalo in the middle, and Ron Dart right on my left here. So they've just finished watching the film. I wasn't here. I didn't really want to be here. I'd rather them just enjoy it on their own. And so we're just shooting a short video here, and they're going to give their impressions upon first seeing the film. So, Ron, do you want to start?
Well, first of all, I think it's an A++ keeper. It's one of the finest films, I think, that has come out that's really explored the issue of heaven and hell, explored it from a multiplicity of directions, so it's not one-dimensional. It's brought in the richness, depth, and breadth of the Christian tradition itself, so whether it's the annihilationist position, the eternal torment, or the universalist, or positions even between that, they've been explored faithfully, honestly. They've allowed each person to speak their mind, and in that sense it's opened up a discussion in a much fuller way in terms of how we approach the issue of heaven and hell, and it's a sort of a plow-to-soil film, and I don't think there's anything like it at the present time, and I think it's going to open up a real rich vein in terms of discussing these larger issues. So I think when it's finally released for the larger public to see, it's going to stimulate a very vibrant discussion on the topics. Any thoughts, Archbishop Lazar?
A vibrant discussion is a rather nice euphemism. What it's going to generate. I think it's going to reveal a lot of the seismic scenes in the Christian church as well, and going to really resonate with people who are seeking Christ but terrified of Christianity, like the young man who he was opposed to Christianity but loves Christ. And I think I was asked this morning by somebody about faith in Christ, and he said, well, it's easy to have faith in Christ, much more difficult to have faith in Christians. And this is one of the aspects of it that is going to come out. There are going to be some intelligent responses and discussions. There are going to be some sincere searching. And there's going to be a lot of hysterical bitterness about it. And I think out of the fullness of everyone's own heart, they're going to respond. And this is one of the nice things about a documentary like this, is because it does reveal the fullness of each person's heart, and each person has to see what's pouring out of their own heart as they respond to something like this, and see how some attitudes and aspects of what has been taught in the name of Christianity is really at the root of a great deal of the violence in the world. Not just the violence of war, but the violence against other individuals, the violence against other groups of people. The root cause of the 30 Years' War, where 40% of the population of Europe perished in a war between Christian denominations over whether or not each one had the correct doctrine, whereas neither one of them had any relationship with Christ. It was all about doctrine. It wasn't about Jesus Christ. It wasn't about the Redeemer or the redemption of the world. It was about ideologies and ideas. And a film like this really reveals the depth to which we abandon Christ in favor of an ideology or what goes on in the fullness of our own hearts. And sometimes it turns out that people are actually angry with God for not thinking the way they think, and really would condemn Christ for not doing things the way they think it should be done. Part of that, of course, is the loss of faith, or the pretense that faith exists, but that if anything challenges your very fragile and poorly balanced illusion of faith, your faith would collapse, because it doesn't really exist anyway. It's really faith in yourself and faith in your own ideology. But anything that shakes that, collapses your entire concept of God, then there's something desperately wrong with the faith we're teaching other people and the faith that we pretend to hold ourselves. That's my comment.
Yeah, I felt the same way. It holds a mirror up. The movie holds a mirror up to our hearts, and it felt to me like hell's not incidental to the movie, but it's the button that you poke to expose a whole lot of other stuff. So, for example, very quickly we begin to tell the interviewer, we tell you who we think God is. Like, what you believe about hell will bring out the rawest expression, the most naked expression of what we really believe about God and what He's like. So you poke the hell button, all of a sudden there's this God and passionate views about what kind of God, and we see in the movie that matters, because it also then, what you believe about God then has a trickle-down effect in some way in what you view about justice, whether it's retributive or restorative, and our need for justice and what that ought to look like. And so your view of God dictates your view of justice, and then your view of justice comes out actually in how you do justice in the world, but even how you react to the questions. There's a visceral reaction at times that I think, oh, that's exactly the reaction we should expect if you believe in this version of hell, this version of God, and this version of justice. The other thing that jumped out at me was just that it's more than a theological debate among Christians. It's you demonstrated in the movie how our culture is just captured by the imagery, and it was profound.
You know, I have to mention, Abba Isaac the Syrian has a homily we translated not long ago called the mirror of the gospel. And you hold the gospel up as a mirror. And two things, comments that he makes, not in the mirror itself, although one he does make in the mirror, says that the justice of God could be like casting sand into the sea, and the sea is the love of God, and the sand can never fill in the sea. But also that the greatest sin of all is the sin against love, as when a friend betrays a friend in this life, or a husband a wife, or a wife a husband. The sin against love burns more deeply than any fire. And that, it seems to me, he says that hell consists in what we see. And what we see is the love and the glory of God. And the fact that we've sinned against love is the fire that burns us, because it burns deeply even in this life. The St. Basil the Great says the river of fire that comes out from the feet of Jesus Christ, the Ancient of Days, in the book of Daniel, in the vision, is the love and glory of God. But it has two characters. To some it gives warmth and light, and to others it burns and imparts, fear and torment. But it's hell and heaven are the same place. They're the presence of the glory and love of God. And it's hell for some and heaven for others. But as St. Cyril of Jerusalem says, our conscience is our only judge. And when we come before Christ and the glory and the love of Christ, our own conscience tells us whether we're to the left or the right. And but St. Abba Isaac the Syrian, I think, does it best in his The Mirror of the Gospel. That you hold up the gospel and you see a mirror of yourself, and you see how unclean and impure you are by the way you understand the gospel, and how you progress spiritually by the way the gospel becomes more of a polished mirror, and the way you can see. The church is in this world not to send anybody to heaven or to hell. The purpose of the church is to prepare people for their encounter with the love and the glory of God. There is no other purpose or reason for the church to be here. That's it. And so it's not about heaven or hell. It's about our encounter with the presence of the love and the glory of God, which fills all things. And so, you can't say they're two different places, because God is everywhere, and the love and the glory of God fills the whole universe. So where could hell be? Except in the presence of the love and glory of God.
I was going to mention one of the, I think, the real positive things of the film is that you have, often this discussion can take place within, say, the Western view of Christianity, Roman Catholic or Protestant,
Right.
various types of Protestantism that would often exclude the Orthodox tradition, or people can go to the Orthodox tradition and ignore the Western tradition. What you've done in Hellbound, you've brought in the very best and wisest of the Orthodox tradition on this view.
Sitting right here.
Yes, yes. You've
Maybe
got,
Frank Schaefer.
yeah, well, you've got Frankie Schaefer and you've got Archbishop Lazar in this. Obviously, two very important people within the North American Orthodox tradition. So that hasn't been ignored. You bring in the richness of the Orthodox and patristic tradition. You've got Origen. Brad comments on Gregory of Nyssa. Both two very important. One a very early theologian, which has been hotly disputed, but Gregory very much is a mature interpreter of Origen. And so to somehow argue the Bible or the Christian tradition as opposed to subtler forms of universalism is just to say, well, hold on here. You know, the Christian tradition, in fact, has a diversity of interpretations. And so in one sense, the film brings to the big T tradition versus, and you also bring the small T traditions, sort of the Reformed tradition, the evangelical tradition. You've got Peter Kraft, elements of the Roman Catholic tradition. You've got diversity within the Protestant tradition, and then you get people who are traditionalism. They just emote.
Right.
You know, there's no thought.
Right.
They just it's just sheer emotion and rhetoric. So yeah. So you've got the big T tradition with its internal conversation on the heaven and hell. You've got the small T traditions, each committed, often uncritically, to either eternal torment, annihilationism, or some form of universalism. Then you've got the ranters, which are traditionalists, and so you get it's a wonderful overview of all the possibilities within the Christian tribe.
Right. Well, and it's interesting too, like the whole role that tradition plays, because I think that, especially within the emergent church, there's an awakening to tradition, big T tradition, but I think there's another group of people within Protestant evangelicalism where I think it almost doesn't matter to them what the Orthodox think or what the Catholics think, because we left those guys for a reason. You know, so the fact that they'll endorse something like a subtle form of universalism perhaps, or something even that's not really, you can't even call it universalism, almost becomes irrelevant for some people because, well, he's wearing a big black hat and a beard, and so there's something weird there. You know what I mean? Like there's that's sort of a visceral reaction that you'll get from some Christians. But I'm hoping what the film will do is to say, no, there's something really important here that has been entrusted to the church and has been living with the church from the beginning. Which is a conversation.
Yeah. And I think one of the important things about it as a documentary is that it does let everyone in. I mean, otherwise it wouldn't be a documentary. It would be a political film.
Right.
But it gives everybody the opportunity to present their views, and then the viewer can make their own decisions.
Right. Yeah.
And that's one of the hallmarks of a decent or really good documentary. Not to take a political slant of some kind. And religion is political. I mean.
Yeah.
Now you also you also have in it this sense when if the gospel is a mirror, and if indeed the topic of hell becomes a mirror, and the documentary itself is a mirror. Earlier I said, there's this idea of a trickle-down effect from God to justice to us, and so. But there's all the reverse seems to be true too, where how much of this God and this doctrine is just a projection of myself and my own fears about death and so on. Or maybe to say it this way, that it's a projection, my doctrine of God and hell is a projection of my biases.
Right.
So what do you say to people who ask you about your bias?
Well, my new response, which I wish I would have come up with like 4 years ago, is, my film was about as unbiased as my audience. And I think that's people come in on some moral high ground, and expect that you're supposed to rise up there, and it's like, come on, nobody's unbiased. We're not objective. We're subjective. But I think the key is to know what is your bias, and are you able to defend it, and are you open to critiques of your bias? Because we're all going to have. I mean, you make a film because you have an agenda, you have a point that you want to make, a statement that you want to make, and so. I think sometimes what people are saying when they say your film is biased is that your film didn't agree with my bias.
Yeah.
Actually, that's really true. The thing is, when we used to say about, we don't think too much of, say, the doctrine of original sin or anything, or this notion of total depravity. But your view of man shapes your view of God, and your view of God shapes your view of man.
Yeah.
Right.
And you can't have an erroneous view of God without having an erroneous view of man.
And vice
and
versa.
vice versa.
Right.
Either way, they reflect each other directly.
Mhm.
What I would kind of hope this documentary, I mean, I hope it gets a lot of mileage, kilometrage, because it's also a mirror.
Yeah.
If people look at it as looking at it in a mirror, how they receive it, and whether they can peacefully or reasonably discuss the contents of it, or whether they have to rage and rant, then it becomes a mirror of their own heart, of what's going on inside their own hearts.
Right.
And if they're terribly unpeaceful, then the reaction is going to be terribly unpeaceful. If they have some kind of peace, or perhaps not the peace that passes all understanding, but nevertheless, some kind of peacefulness about their relationship with Christ, and some kind of, I would say, assuredness, not certainty, but assuredness of their relationship with Christ, and they can be open to reflect on it in a completely different way than if their faith is very fragile, and if their faith could shatter easily.
Yeah.
They're going to be, the people whose faith is fragile will be more angry and more outraged, and the people who have a solid foundation in Christ will be much more peaceful and open to it. So,
Well, I think you raise I think that's a really interesting point, because I think the whole issue of hell becomes a mirror as well, because in terms of how you react. Sorry, I've totally lost my point. But
Well,
Yeah.
it's sort of in the
Let
background
me
for you. I was
formulate.
going to ask you, what were some of the things, sort of the motivation, or some of the reasons that, caused you to say, I want to do a film on this?
Well, good. You reminded me of my point. I think the question I have is why are people? What made me want to make this film is new information. So the way I described it to Brad several years ago when I was editing his book on hell, which is really what inspired me to go down this path, was it's like when I became a Christian, something really good happened, but it was almost like a virus snuck in, and over time it gets to the point where the virus threatens to overwhelm the host. And what is the virus? It's fear. I mean, I remember being a 9-year-old kid the summer I became a Christian, standing on my driveway on the farm in Saskatchewan and looking at my family working in the garden and realizing, if they don't know what I know, they're all going to go to hell. And just feeling sick. Because I was too afraid to tell them. Because the people who I'd become Christians through, the Mennonites, my parents made fun of them. And the last thing I was going to do was admit that I was one of them.
but see, the word gnosis that you use
Yeah.
is one of the problems.
Right. It's Gnostic. They have to
It's
know
a
the
very Gnostic
information.
idea. You're saved by knowing.
Mhm.
You're not saved by doing.
Right.
Because after all, doing is works.
Yeah.
So you're only saved by knowing.
Right.
That's Gnosticism.
Right.
Yeah.
Well,
That's one of the problems with it.
But the thing is I guess the question I come up with now is that, so working on Brad's book and also dealing with stuff that looks at the atonement differently and all that sort of thing, it's all new information, which I absorb like a sponge. But there's a lot of people out there that are afraid of new information, that if you're coming along with new information that might threaten their view of the gospel, of hell, of all this sort of thing, they get very upset and they get very antagonistic, like you're talking about. And so I guess the question I have is, I don't think that I'm in a superior position, I don't get bothered by this stuff, but I'm so eager to know what I don't know, because I have this theory that we hold our opinions based on our ignorance, not based on our knowledge. Our ignorance of what we don't yet know. This is any opinion we hold or belief should kind of be viewed as a waypoint on the way to the next thing we're going to learn.
Yeah.
To me, that creates an adventure. Life is always fascinating because you never know what new thing you're going to discover that's going to open up a whole new vista. And so I'm hoping that this film isn't something that shuts down conversation and entrenches, but it maybe lowers the temperature a little bit so people go, this is interesting. Maybe I'm going to refute this, but I'm going to at least investigate it first. So,
What is it? I was
Oh,
going
go
to say,
ahead,
just what is it that causes the gap between sort of the need for theological or exegetical certainty versus intellectual theological curiosity, the probing, sending out probes into eternity and see what they bring back? Some people seem to have this desperate need for absolute certainty, and if you question that, and they've so identified certainty with faith and with God, if you question it, you're questioning God, rather than just a certain level of mystery, uncertainty, intellectual adventure. What is the the great chasm that separates these two approaches to the faith journey.
Well, unless you have a theory on that.
No, well,
Yeah.
it's just a question that came up earlier today when I'm dealing with somebody who the faith became challenged because certain prayers weren't answered. And it's so how they said you believe in Christ. So if the prayers that you put forth are not answered, if things don't work the way you understand they should work, but it's a very, very fragile faith, because the faith has to be based on some phenomena that take place. And so you can even make up stories of phenomena that take place to reassure yourself about your faith. But it's a fragility of faith that requires a constant reinforcement through some kind of a miracle. You know, even like the legend of the Grand Inquisitor, where the Grand Inquisitor condemns Christ, and he said, "You gave them freedom, you should have given them miracles, because miracles compel them to believe."
Right.
And freedom gives them a choice, and so they can freely believe. But what happens when you come to that kind of a situation? Okay, your prayers aren't being answered, so now we're going to lower the faith from the magic we expected to a moralism, to a moral code. So the entire faith is reduced down to a moral code, and that moral code's absolute and fixed. Because you don't know the next culture over, and you don't know what's different there.
Right.
But it's absolute and fixed, so the whole faith is reduced down to a moral code. And this moral code then is what the faith is all about. And any new information might change the texture of that code or that law that you've established. And the faith is so fragile because it can't be reinforced by miracles or magic, whichever.
Because it really has no foundation.
Because it has no foundation at all. That's the whole problem. It has no foundation.
Yeah.
But, there are certain... I say that the West has too many dogmas to begin with. The basic what's there in the Nicene Creed, the Nicean Symbol of Faith, is foundational. But in Gregory of Nyssa's Life of the Prophet Moses, he says that we have a contradiction here. That he's standing firmly upon the rock, but he's ascending. And usually when one is standing in one place, one is not moving. But here he ascends because he's standing on the rock. So he's standing on that rock, let's say the Nicene Creed, the heart of the Christian message. But he's not stationary. He's rising to something more, something fuller, something more complete. And it isn't gnosis, it's experience.
There is another element too, and that is that there's a certain kind of doctrine of election that says that the sign of your election, whether you are in, is certitude, assurance, beyond all doubt. If you, and John Calvin says this in the Institutes. It's like the sign of your election is assurance of your salvation, assurance that you are one of the elect. So if you don't have that assurance, you're not one of the elect. So you need to make yourself sure somehow. But then he also, on the next page, warns, and there will be those who delude themselves into assurance.
Yeah.
And so, but to answer Ron's question, then that would be one reason why there's a lust for certitude, because it's a sign that I'm saved.
And if you have to struggle, it's because you've got it wrong, not because you're a human.
Well, I think Ernest Becker, too, in The Denial of Death, has a lot to say about this, too, because I think that it comes down to the role that religion plays, and that if this is, in a sense, not helping you come to terms with your mortality, but in a sense to flee from your mortality, if it gets taken away, you're going to have to confront the thing that that's the thing that most of us spend all of our lives trying to avoid, which is our own mortality. And so I think that when you fit your life into a system that quiets the voices of fear, when somebody comes along and threatens that system, you're going to fight it with your whole life, because everything's depending on it staying there. And I don't know, it's
And that goes back to the beginning, doesn't it?
I think it's a very primal thing, and so, and it's very, I think it's just a very human thing. And this is why, again, you'll see scapegoating and all that sort of thing, because you're going to be scapegoating. You have to expel the individuals that are threatening the system, because otherwise it all, you have to have, Daniel Taylor, who we talked to in the making of this film, he talked about the difference between unanimity and unity. And unanimity is very brittle because it demands everyone. One person can break it, And so that's why you see people getting expelled, because we've got to keep this. We've got to keep a united front. Whereas unity is flexible, because we can be, we all, of course, are part of different faith traditions here, but we can be unified around what are the most important questions.
Yeah.
And we can have some good discussions about what the answers are, but
It's the questions.
we're likely not going to throw anyone off the balcony here as a result of our differences of opinion.
Yeah, that's. I think the quest for absolutes is one of the great dangers of humanity anyway, because the absolute is not a synonym for truth. It's a synonym for an ossified mind or a dictatorship, or a hopeless surrender to somebody who you think can solve all your problems without your efforts. And all, but we should never think in terms of absolute as being a synonym for any kind of truth. It isn't.
There's a tension, isn't there, though? Because on the one hand, faith and mystery, if pushed too far, leads to no ground to stand on. On the other hand, assurance and certainty leads to mirages that don't exist in reality. And how do we live in the tension between a faith of wisdom that honors mystery, but there are also certain markings or cairns that we can say to guide us to the ridges and peaks that give us that great views and vision of the eternal kingdom itself. And some people err too far on the side of certainty, and others err too far on the side of skepticism and agnosticism. And a mature faith, particularly in dealing with the heaven, hell, the juridical view of the atonement, some want to freeze certain positions, and it gives them certainty, and others say, well, hold on, there's more to it than that, but we're not going to exclude that. And I think that's one of the riches of the film. You are including those different positions without demeaning or diminishing one. You're giving them their voice, but you're also honestly allowing the universalist perspective to be spoken, to be aired, and out of that the audience can then say,
Yeah.
I didn't realize there were all these perspectives amongst thoughtful people, and it all belongs to the conversation of the great tradition.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's a difference between assurance and certainty. Yeah, we have assurance, but we can't always have certainty.
And the object is important. So I have deep assurance in God that He's good, and that God is love, and that Christ is the perfect expression of this. But see, the object there is of my assurance is God Himself and God in Christ, versus my certainty that I've got the right doctrine that will make sure I'm in, and then me and my belief system and my experience resume and all of it. So now I've focused inward on the certitude around myself, which makes for ugly theology. Dostoevsky, was it him that said beauty will save the world?
Yeah.
And what he does is he introduces this idea that beauty is actually a criteria for truth. And when you have an ugly doctrine, it's probably not true, and it's ugly by perhaps what it says about God, making God ugly, and also you become ugly in your need to impose that doctrine. And then, so one of the things that, for me, even in the film, is there were certain people you interviewed that there's a beautiful gentleness about them, and I'm not even sure I agree with them, but I'm like, there's something true and compelling about this because it's beautiful, and I think that matters.
Yeah.
And I also want to say that that's true. This is a beautiful film, and it's important for people to see it, I believe.
Whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report.
Yes.
We too often it becomes Zoroastrian. You see, we don't know whether we're following Ahriman or the other one, or Ahura Mazda, but sometimes we confuse the two of them, and we confuse Satan and God in many respects. But one thing is that the whole Mishnah on the fall of mankind is that Adam and Eve left an atmosphere of unselfish love and fell into egotism, self-centeredness, self-focus. But I'm saved and you're not is one of the marks of the fall. Me, I. It feeds your egotism. Even the rapture which one of these novelty doctrines, is something that feeds your ego. And it's all about your ego. You know, Christ is going to return during my lifetime.
Mm-hmm. Next week, probably.
Surely he'd want to meet me when he comes.
Of course.
You know, you know. So he'll come in my lifetime because I mean, you know.
And I will ride with him as we slay the wicked together.
Yeah, yeah. So that's part of the whole thing about heaven and hell, though. Still are shaped by our own ego and the fact that people we don't like should be punished and they should burn in hell and they should, you know, because you know they just irritated me, so they must really irritate God more.
Well, and I think that's an important thing to bring up, though, and this is what I don't want to say much about the film in details, but it was important for me to begin with the pain of people who've been victimized by great evil, because otherwise I think we can tend to be glib. And one thing Richard Beck, psychologist Richard Beck, who's from Abilene Christian University, huge influence on me, he talks about the need for the language of hell, because if we take that away, all we have left is the language of politics or psychology. So when it comes to confronting a horrific event, in a sense, we need to bring the hell language out, because it's the only way, it's the only language capable of describing what we're going through. And so, yeah, there's sometimes when bad things happen, we describe it as hell on earth, and we say whoever did this deserves to burn in hell. I think that's a really legitimate cry from the human heart. The question is, what do we do with that?
Yeah, it is. I remember in Solovki Monastery in the far north, during the early communist era, a lot of the hierarchy senior church people were sent there, and they had to go ice fishing for their own food and all that. I mean, 3 years was the life expectancy.
Wow.
And when Lenin died, the guards came in and said, you have to stand for a moment of silence because Comrade Lenin has died. Everybody stood up except one archimandrite, one priest. And Hilarion Troitsky, the holy new martyr Hilarion Troitsky, was archbishop. So why didn't you stand? And he said, why should I stand? Lenin is already burning in hell. And he says, brother, Lenin may have repented with his last breath and he's already rejoicing in heaven, but you, unable to forgive, might be the one who burns in hell.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
Yeah.
So,
There is that need and cry. I'm just reviewing a book right now called Healing the Gospel. What's the guy's name?
Derek Flood.
Derek Flood. And he comes at Romans this way, and he says, Paul is not speaking to people, as Luther thought, who are carrying the burden of guilt and looking to escape the wrath of God. He's actually speaking to Jewish Christians who want wrath for their enemy and who still believe in the law as judgment and condemnation of the enemy. And Paul comes along and he says, actually, you know, there's a righteousness and a justice that comes apart from the law that reconciles and restores. And so even in these Roman Christians, there's that desire. Well, and of course, it's, you know, they're under Nero. Who better to send off to torment? And we dare not just silence their cry for how long and what. But then, what's the response going to be?
yeah, well, what holiness and righteousness are tricky words anyway.
Yeah.
Because when righteousness is a moral code, the fulfilling of a moral code, any pagan can do that. You know, if that's what righteousness consists in. Heaven knows that the Inuit were righteous because, you know, but I mean, when the priests came from Russia to Russian America and Alaska, they were so impressed by the morality of the pagans that they preferred to live with the pagans rather than the Russian trappers. Because the pagans had a very rich morality. No one was ever an orphan. If you caught a fish and the neighbor didn't, you split the fish in half and gave part to your neighbor.
Compassion, then, right? Morality is compassion.
Morality is the only definition of evil that I think is valid is a lack of empathy. That is what evil is, the lack of empathy.
It's choosing self.
And when people have empathy for somebody else, they've already overcome the main power of evil. And the fact that old people were not just cast out to die, somebody fed them, somebody cared for them. Orphans were taken into other people's care. Somebody who didn't have food, the ones who caught food would share it with the rest. That's morality. Because that's love of your neighbor. I mean, Christ only gave us 4 commandments and said, if you love me, keep my commandments. All 4 commandments are about love in your relationship with other people.
Yeah.
And that's empathy is the antithesis of evil, genuine empathy. And that's to have empathy with people in hell. But St. Abba Anthony the Great says it would be a great mistake to think that God would love people in hell any less than he would love people in heaven. But to look at what it is in this life already, heroin addicts are living in hell.
Yeah, they
now,
know what it is.
already.
Yeah.
And what we do is usually put our foot on the head and shove them down deeper into the coals instead of trying to lift them up out of the coals. But if we have empathy for people who are already living in hell in this life, to realize that hell is here and now already existing, and some people suffer. Inner human suffering is far greater than physical suffering, and it's less tolerable, and it's what drives most people to suicide. People commit suicide far more quickly from their inner suffering than from their physical suffering, and we have to realize that that's a foretaste of hell in itself, and that we think about all this stuff in the afterlife. And as Christian people, as people who say that we're followers of Christ, we should be interested right here and now in pulling people out of the hell that they have to live in already right now here. And let eternity take care of itself.
I was just going to say to Kevin, you did the yeoman's work on the film. Maybe we should wind this up. Any final few thoughts on Hellbound?
Well, actually, I was going to ask you guys the question. If you could just say one group of people you think should see this film, or you think would really benefit from seeing the film, who would you pick out? Who would you say is the ideal audience for Hellbound?
I would think, well, first, the broad range of Christians themselves, because you address the Orthodox, you address the Catholic, because the Orthodox are a complex tradition as much as the Roman Catholics. You interviewed Peter Kraft, and he gave you one perspective. You're going to get people in the Roman Catholic tradition, particularly between Trent and Vatican II, which are going to be very strong eternal torment, and whether they draw on Dante or anyone else in that, in the Inferno. You've got people coming out of various forms of Protestantism, evangelical, Reform, conservative evangelical. They should definitely see that with a very one-dimensional view. I think people who are very cynical, say, of Christianity, and just think, again, have a very simplistic view of it, almost a Sunday school understanding. You're giving a more mature view. So I think the film can reach far beyond even the Christian community to introduce them to a much richer and more nuanced conversation within the great tradition itself.
Yeah, I have to say it's something for all people who profess Christianity and all people who have renounced Christianity for various reasons. And it would do the broad Orthodox community a lot of good to see the film.
Interesting.
Because, we have osmosis from what's around us.
Right.
And we lose track ourselves sometimes of what the actual tradition is. And we really need sometimes to be recalled to that. And so it's for all of us, everyone who's lost the roots of the liturgy in the ancient tradition. The liturgy is older than the New Testament.
Right.
But everybody who's lost that root and that understanding of that relationship, and the purpose of the existence of a church on earth, what is it here for? Is it a court of law or is it a spiritual hospital? Are we ministers prosecuting attorneys, or are we spiritual healers?
Right.
So it's all of us. I mean, the Orthodoxy is certainly, within the Orthodox community, there's no such thing as purity.
Right.
It isn't there.
Right.
And everybody needs to be recalled to the tradition we profess, but don't even know what it is for the most part. Yeah, it's for all of us.
And that seems like
all of us equally.
That seems like a daily thing.
Yeah, but it's for all Christians equally, and people who have renounced Christianity as well.
Yeah, I think three people need to see it. Joe needs to see it, who will not become a Christian because of what he heard we believe about hell. And Susan needs to see it because she's ready to give up her faith because what she's been told she needs to believe about hell. And then Bob and the rest of us who are trying to find faith after cynicism might find some fresh reason to believe here.
Can I put a footnote here from Romiana.
Sure.
I have in my icon corner a quote from Romiana, which I love so much. And she says, Lord, if I love you for the hope of heaven, let me be deprived of heaven. Lord, if I love you from the fear of hell, let me burn in hell. Lord, if I love you for yourself, let me not be deprived of your glory.
Let's go with that one.
I like that. Yeah. Well, I would say for me, it's been such a fascinating. I mean, I don't know. You folks don't know, but these guys have been speaking into my life, and I hold them largely responsible for the making of this film, for good or for evil. Hopefully for good. But it's been such a transformational thing for me to be able to dive deep into this stuff, and but humility. I really structure the film into 3 acts. Act 1 I'm calling certainty, Act 2 ambiguity, and Act 3 humility. And to me, it's a call to humility all the time, because I have to say that the people I was most skeptical about interviewing, who I felt, oh boy, either I think this person's really far to the right, or somebody had experience that I was very skeptical of, and those were, of all the people I interviewed, the ones where the people were the most gracious, the most humble, the most loving, and you come away from that transformed and humbled yourself to go, who was I to think what I thought before I went into this interview? And so for me, it's kind of like a previous film I worked on called With God on Our Side. It's this constant reminder that, am I using my theology to lift myself up above other people? Am I using my theology to beat other people up, to prove to myself every day how smart I am or how good I am? Am I this little man inside, just trying to prove that I'm not a little man? And I think that that's something we have to walk out every day, and that's what I'm hoping this film can accomplish, is to get, because that's been the effect it's had on me, is to say, Kevin, come down off your high horse for a little while, give it a rest. But it's something that it's so easy to forget, because you something happens and you climb right back on board.
So hellboundthemovie.com.
Yeah.
In theaters in September?
In September, yeah. And if you want to know if it's opening in your city, you can check out the website, and you can actually go on the website and demand the movie. I'm also blogging on there, so come along and comment, and we're on Facebook, Twitter, all these different places.
And you can see this video, of course, on Canadian Orthodox Broadcasting.ca. And if you send an email, if you can't find where the movie's playing, or when it's going to be playing, or if it's going to be playing, send us an email too, and we'll pass it on to Kevin, and we'll find out the schedule and where it's going to be playing. And by all means, see the movie, and open your mind and your heart both to the movie. Thank you for joining us, and God bless you.